What is verbal aspect? Why is it something that everybody's talking about? Do we need to know about this as expositors, as translators, and as exegetes of the text? Well, in this video, we're going to take a quick look at verbal aspect. We're going to understand where it comes from, and then we're going to take a quick look at why it is significant. Hi, I'm Darryl Burling from Master New Testament Greek, and I help people like you with the tools, habits, and system to master the Greek of the New Testament. If that sounds helpful, go ahead, hit subscribe to this channel, and then hit the notify bell to be told or informed when new videos are released. So what is verbal aspect, and where did it come from? Well, you may know that once upon a time, Greek scholars regarded tense as conveying the temporal reference in which the verb takes place. That is to say, that if it was in the present tense, that the verb was taking place in the present from the point of view of the speaker. Or if it was in the aorist, it was taking place in the past from the point of view of the speaker. Or if it was in the future, it was taking place in the future from the point of view of the speaker. And so this was how tense was regarded in the Greek of the New Testament. Now, over the last 100 years, there's been a lot of work done by a number of scholars that have challenged this understanding. And this has really come about because three streams of scholarly work have merged together. There's New Testament exegesis and research. There is philology, Greek philology, looking at the classics. And then, of course, there's just general linguistics. And as these three streams have merged, there has been a new consensus start to emerge out of this commingling of these streams, if you will. And this all started around 100 years ago. However, it didn't really reach mainstream until really in the 1980s. At least this is in the New Testament research area. And it came together with the work of two scholars who worked independently of one another but came to very similar conclusions. Both of these scholars, Boost Fanning and Stanley Porter, recognized that aspect was built in, verbal aspect was an idea that was built in to the notion of the verb tense itself. Now, they still came to very different conclusions, and this is one of the reasons why today we have different conversations and different understandings of what verbal aspect really is. On the one side, Stanley Porter came to the conclusion that time was not part of what was encoded in the tense form of the Greek verb. In other words, if you looked at a present tense verb, you could not say that the present tense always meant that that verb took place in the present. In fact, he argued that because there were times where the aorist was not always in the past or the present was not always in the present, that can't be the core meaning of the verb. So he argued that time actually came out as a function of the context and how the word was working within the context, rather than a function of the encoding of the verb itself. Boost Fanning, on the other hand, came to the conclusion that indeed time is part of the tense form itself. However, it's not as significant as the idea of aspect. And so both of these men came to the conclusion that verbal aspect was the primary idea of the tense form in the Koine Greek period. And so this sparked a good discussion that goes on to this day. Boost Fanning's work has largely been more widely accepted than Stanley Porter's in a lot of ways because it's closer to the traditional view where the present is the present and so on. It retains that idea of time. But on the other hand, some people in the New Testament realm have tested Stanley Porter's work and have found that it actually holds water, most notably Rodney. But that's not all of it. There's another aspect of both of these two men and their work that is also a distinction. On the one hand, Stanley Porter recognizes that there are three aspects, and I'll talk about what an aspect is in a moment, and on the other side, Boost Fanning recognizes there are only two. And so this has led to these two streams within this verbal aspect discussion. On the one hand, how many aspects are there, and on the other hand, how important is time? There's another aspect of this too, and that is, if it isn't time, if time isn't built into this verb itself, then how do we account for the fact that an imperfect, for instance, is very often used for past tense, or a present tense verb is very often used for present, but not always? How do we account for that? And so these are things that are being accounted for in the current discussion. Now that leads me to ask this question. What is verbal aspect? Well, in a nutshell, verbal aspect refers to the point of view of the author with regards to the action that is being taken. In other words, the author is describing the action in a certain way. And again, this is where the idea of 2 versus 3 aspects really is important. So the two primary aspects that everybody agrees on is that there is what's called a perfective aspect on the one hand and an imperfective aspect on the other. When somebody describes an action using the perfective aspect, they're looking at the event as a whole. On the other side, when somebody looks at an event using the imperfective aspect, they're looking at the event or the action as in something taking place in progress. And really the most common way of articulating this, or at least one very common way of articulating this, is the idea of a parade. So if you imagine, for instance, you are looking at a parade, now it's going to make a big difference how you look at that parade. Are you going to be standing on the street corner watching it as it goes past, or are you going to be in a helicopter above seeing the entire parade in one snapshot? That's kind of the difference. So the perfective aspect is like you're in the helicopter looking at the parade. You can see the beginning, you can see the end, you can see everything in the middle. But when you say, hey, there's a parade, you're referring to the whole thing, not any one part of it. By contrast, the person who's on the street corner, who's looking at the parade as it goes past, he sees the parade as it progresses. So he sees the beginning of the parade, he watches all the individuals in the parade slowly go past, he watches the end of the parade as it comes and goes, and then the parade is over. And so those are two very different ways of seeing the same action. And that's what verbal aspect does. The perfective aspect is from the helicopter, the imperfective aspect is from the street corner looking at the thing as it goes by. So one of them sees it as a whole from the outside, one of them sees it as an in-progress event from the inside, if you like. And so that's what verbal aspect is. Now the third aspect that some, such as Porter, for instance, argues for is stative aspect. And in a stative aspect, the idea is that here's a state that exists in the present. Okay, may or may not be part of what's happened in the past, but it's a state. And everybody agrees that there is such a thing as state. The only discussion is, where does it come from? Is it a function of the form of the verb, mostly in the perfect form? So if you have the perfect verb in Greek, that is often regarded as stative. For instance, Rodney follows this track where he gives you the stative verb following in the heels of Stan Porter. On the other hand, Constantine Campbell argues against the idea of state, saying it's part of the context. And so he regards that the perfect verb is actually conveying imperfective state. And there's some good reasons for both of these arguments. So that brings me to another thing that we need to think about when it comes to the idea of verbal aspect. And that is a distinction between semantics and pragmatics. And in a nutshell, semantics is the idea that something is encoded, hard-coded into the form of the verb. So this is, if it's an aorist, the aorist is telling us something about the verb. That's what the semantics are. Now, historically, the traditional view of a verb said that time was a semantic value. And now, most people, most modern New Testament scholars, agree that time is at least not the main aspect of the encoding of the verb form. On the other side, there's pragmatics, and pragmatics regard how the verb is working within the context in which it forms. Now, this will take into account things like the lexeme, what the word actually means. It will take into account other words around it, the clause structure, adverbs, things like that are going to modify the verb. It's also going to take into account the genre of the text. And so all of these go together to, from a pragmatic perspective, to give some form of meaning to the verb form itself. And so the argument is that time is actually a semantic value, and Constantine Campbell would also argue that state is a pragmatic concept as well, built into the lexeme and the context of the verb as well. And so those two things are also key aspects of this discussion. So at this stage, you might be asking, well, so what? Why does this make any difference? And so if you look at the tense form itself, there are really two things coded into the tense form. One of those is the idea of aspect, imperfective aspect and perfective aspect. So those two things are encoded in the form of the verb. Another important aspect of this is really the idea of proximity or remoteness. Now, and this is how we're starting to understand the idea of time being built into the verb form itself, although we're not understanding it as time itself, but with this concept of remoteness or proximity, and this can be applied in a number of ways. Let's take an aorist. So an aorist is perfective in the sense that it refers to an event as a completed whole, but at the same time it's also carrying the idea of remoteness, that the event just happened, it's kind of just one thing on the journey, and we're not really focused on the internal details of it, and so we're just going to walk past it. It doesn't need to be near to us in that proximal kind of sense. And so this accounts for why an aorist can be used both in the past tense, because that fits the past tense idea. It's remote, right? It's temporally remote, and therefore it can be remote, but it can also be used in the present. And so here you have the idea of it just has happened. It's an event that is taking place right now, but we're not concerned about the details of it, and so it's still remote, but from a conceptual point of view. But we also have the idea of an aorist in the future, and this means that an aorist can be looking at an event that will yet happen, but is looking at it from a remote perspective. And again, you have the temporal idea built into this nearness or remoteness in this case, but again, you can see that it can be used either way. And so the idea of remoteness doesn't necessarily get tied to temporality, but it can be used with the idea of time as well. And so this is really where time for an aorist, for instance, can make a lot of sense. The remote idea that's built into the aorist is significant when it comes to the aorist form. However, it can also be used in the future, it can be used in the present, and it gives it its versatility. And so if we look at the semantic encoding by tense form, we end up with this, where in the present tense we have an imperfective aspect looking at the event as in progress, but yet it has this near proximity. It's focused on an event that it's really drawing you into the process so that you can see it from the inside. The imperfect has the idea of imperfective aspect, and yet it's focused on remoteness. And so here you can see the distinction between an imperfect and an aorist. In the imperfect, you have the imperfective form, but you have remoteness. In the aorist, you still have the remoteness, but it's perfective. It's looking at the event as a whole. In the future, you have a perfective idea again, but the proximity is looking at it from a temporal perspective, because the future tense always refers to the future, and therefore it always has that temporal idea to it, and therefore it has a temporal remoteness. Now, this is one of the interesting things, is that during the time of the Koine period, there is this transition going on where the language itself is moving from a spatial language to a temporal language. So today, all of the Greek tenses are largely temporal. And so here we see one of those. It's really the first cab off the rank, if you like, in terms of tenses that have adopted an entirely temporal form. In the perfect, going by what Constantine Campbell argues for the perfect tense form, he would argue that it's an imperfective aspect, but it has a heightened proximity. And that means that it's closer. He's really drawing you in a perfect verb so that you can see it from the inside in a way that is even closer than what you'd see in the perfect. Now, that may mean that it's still in progress or has a current status to it, but it doesn't necessarily have that. And he gives some really good examples in his book that explain this. And then, of course, there's the pluperfect, which, like the perfect, is also imperfective and also has the heightened idea of proximity, but in this case, it refers to remoteness. And so those are the ways that the different verb forms encode these two ideas, aspect and proximity. And you can see from this how the imperfect or the aorist, for instance, could be used consistently, reasonably consistently at least, for the past tense, because the idea of remoteness is built into those. In the next video, we're going to take a look at exactly how this pans out. We're going to look at how to determine the difference between what's in the semantics of the verb, the lexeme of the verb, and the context surrounding the verb, so that you can see in a little more detail how verbal aspect works and how it helps us to understand what's going on in a text. So stay tuned for that. Let me ask you a question as we think through this just at the end here. What were you trained in? Were you trained in the system where you learnt with verbal aspect, or were you trained in an older system where time was built into the tense form? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you and hear how you were trained. I know for me, for instance, I was trained in the system where tense included the idea of time, although as a background idea. And so there was always time in the indicative, but never outside of the indicative. And so while aspect was something we looked at, it was something that didn't have the same emphasis as what I think it probably should have had. at. So let me know which school you were trained in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you there. If this has been helpful for you, consider subscribing to this channel and hit the notify bell to be notified when new videos come out. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. See you then.